So, as I've mentioned before, I have for a long time been a huge fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I think I first watched this show when I was like 13 years old, and I've pretty much rewatched it every single year since then. There's just something about this series which always seems to draw me back in. I imagine it has something to do with the show's across-the-board quality. This is one of those very rare pieces of work where basically everything about it is 10 out of 10, whether that's the perfectly paced episodic storytelling, the incredibly ambitious and creative magic system and world building, some of the most likable characters ever conceived, some of the best character arcs ever written, this brilliantly quirky sense of humor which, no matter how old you are or how many times you've heard all the jokes, never really stops being funny. Also an iconic score from Jeremy Zuckerman, stellar animation greatly inspired by the likes of Studio Ghibli, and to top it all off, we have this really dense thematic structure which is kind of like the bedrock to the entire show, dealing with these complex subjects such as death, war, colonization, and genocide, alongside some incredibly spiritual topics such as redemption, mindfulness, non-dualism, interconnectedness, non-attachment, and impermanence, all just in this beautifully mature and nuanced way, to the point where it can be easy to forget that this show was aired on Nickelodeon, and that initially, most of its viewers would have been literal children. Because yes, while it is great as a kids show, in fact, it's one of the very best, I have only found myself appreciating Avatar: The Last Airbender more and more the older I've got. It is probably the single most instrumental piece of media I have personally experienced in my life so far. It has inspired me so much from both a creative and a more spiritual point of view that I've wanted to make a video about it for years. And with Netflix's live-action adaptation having recently come out, something that was, you know, pretty bad, I thought I would give myself and others a counter-agent, if you will, by spending some time talking about this incredible show, taking it season by season and reviewing plus ranking each of the episodes. Now, when I say ranking, it is kind of unfair because, in my opinion, every episode of this show is good. Yes, even that one, and especially that one. So just remember to take what I'm saying, especially when it comes to criticisms I may have about certain episodes, with that context in mind, because if we're being honest, there are no bad episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender. This first video is going to focus on Book 1, Water, but will contain spoilers for the entire show, so if you haven't watched the whole thing, honestly, go watch it, have your entire view of the world changed, and then come back. But anyway, let's just get this out of the way before we even begin. Book 1, Water, is the weakest of Avatar's 3 seasons. I don't think anyone's gonna disagree with me there, but if we're being honest, I think this season can sometimes be just slightly underrated and perhaps even underappreciated by the Avatar fandom. Mainly just because upon rewatching this series with the knowledge of what's to come, Book 1 can often end up feeling rather small and insignificant when compared to the sheer confidence, scope, and overall brilliance of books 2 and 3. Many of the episodes in Avatar's first season can feel like filler at first glance. Integral characters such as Toph and Azula are completely absent, and the characters we do have don't feel anywhere near as fleshed out as we know they will end up becoming. I mean, for the first half of this season, we aren't even privy to Aang and Zuko's backstories, you know? Leading to a slight lack of depth at times. Book 1 also does just unfortunately suffer from some minor pacing issues. It's something that the next 2 seasons would have no problem pretty much executing to perfection, but yeah, this first season can at times end up feeling a little messy. For example, I think the writers kind of shot themselves in the foot by only setting 3 episodes in the Northern Water Tribe. However, if we can just temporarily expunge books 2 and 3 from our mind and look at Book 1, Water, in a vacuum, I think we can all agree that this is still an incredibly solid season of television. Yes, it is clearly a show still trying to find its footing, especially in its first half, but it is, nevertheless, a rock-solid introduction to this world and these characters, laying down much of the essential groundwork for the masterpiece that Avatar: The Last Airbender would ultimately end up becoming in its second and third seasons. And let's face it, if you're watching this video, you clearly liked it enough to finish the series. In fact, I can't imagine that anyone who got to episodes 7 or 8 wouldn't end up watching the entire show. But before getting to the Winter Solstice 2-parter, which is where I kind of believe Avatar: The Last Airbender truly becomes Avatar: The Last Airbender, if that makes sense, We need to get through the first 6 episodes, which, again, are not bad by any means. In fact, when compared to any other animated show, they're great, but when compared to the rest of the show, can feel like a bit of a slog to get through, especially on your 100th rewatch. But anyway, let us begin with, of course, the first thing we experience in The Boy in the Iceberg, Avatar's first episode, is an extended version of the now iconic title sequence, which, as everyone has already commented on, is a perfect introduction not just to this episode, but every episode of the show, effectively conveying the world, the magic system, the impending conflict, Katara's endearing sense of hope, and the pressure on Aang's shoulders to defeat the Fire Lord, all in an incredibly efficient and poetic fashion. And if we're being honest with each other, it's probably my favourite thing in this entire first episode. I think especially this extended version of the opening, which we only hear once throughout the whole show, is a truly beautiful prologue, and I get chills every time I watch it. We are then, of course, introduced to Katara and Sokka, who I think this episode does a decent job of introducing. It is a bit weird seeing them in their undeveloped states. I often forget that Sokka starts the series as kind of like this sexist douchebag, considering he ends up becoming one of the most likable characters in the entire show. And I do just also think that the Southern Water Tribe is kind of a boring setting overall throughout these first 2 episodes. Of course, this is a purposeful decision from the writers. It's a place whose infrastructure and culture and sense of fun has just been completely decimated by war. It all makes sense and it's good for fleshing out the world, but yeah. It is just kind of empty and a bit boring, isn't it? When it comes to ordinary worlds where the hero's journey begins, let's just say that the Southern Water Tribe is definitely more Tatooine than the Shire. Also, fun fact, did you know that according to the comics, this is not the only village in the Southern Water Tribe, and that there are actually many more scattered across the place? I don't know, the comics for me are not really canon, but still, I like this slight lore change, as it always felt a bit weird that this was supposedly all the human life left in the entire South Pole. Anyway, we then of course meet Aang. That's why he's the GOAT! Whose praises I am going to sing time and time again throughout this review, as I personally believe him to be one of the 2 contenders for the show's best character. I think this guy is vastly underrated by the majority of the Avatar fandom, for a plethora of reasons we will be getting into later, but like, come on man, he's a monk. They made their Joseph Campbell-esque fantasy protagonist a monk, who's just like this funny, chill guy, but who's also at times really terrifying and tragic. Like, there's just so much depth to him, and yeah, what an incredible protagonist. Anyway, it's also here where we meet the other frontrunner for the best character in the entire show. Finally. That's why he's the GOAT! Yeah, Zuko is just something else. Most definitely the greatest character arc of all time, which is a huge statement to make, but honestly, I don't even think it's a hot take, you know what I mean? He is the character who transforms Avatar: The Last Airbender from merely a masterpiece to, at the very least, one of the 21st century's best pieces of art. There, I said it. Speaking of superlatives, Uncle Iroh. That's why he's the GOAT! Probably my pick for the show's 3rd best character. He's also someone whose backstory we don't find out about for a good while, but I think the show does such a great job in this first season at subtly hinting towards the man's power, wisdom, and spiritual depth. For example, I love the moment here when Zuko sees the light beam in the sky, and Iroh's playing like element solitaire with these tiles, and places one down with the Air Nation symbol. It's little moments like these which Avatar is so consistently brilliant at. I'd say that the rest of The Boy in the Iceberg is pretty standard stuff. I do think it does a commendable job when you think about all the information it has to convey in 22 minutes. I love this comment from Aang. You just sneezed and flew 10 feet in the air.
Really? It fell higher than that.
And I feel like this moment perfectly sums up Zuko and Iroh's relationship.
Why don't you enjoy a cup of calming jasmine tea?
I don't need any calming tea! I need to capture the Avatar!
However, I'd also say that there are some things which aren't exactly executed all that well, and I'm mainly talking about characters' reactions just not being realistic at all. I'll go into this more when discussing episode 3 because I actually think it's the show's biggest flaw, but to sum it up very quickly here, I find it bizarre that basically everyone throughout the series, but especially in these first few episodes, don't seem to be that bewildered upon meeting Aang. Like, sure, Gran mentions that no one's seen an airbender for 100 years, but you think there would be more of a fanfare upon discovering that an entire race of people you thought had gone extinct 100 years ago due to a genocide are actually not yet extinct. especially considering this guy is a literal child who has the tattoos that only airbending masters have. Even Aang's reaction to finding out that he's been in the ice for 100 years isn't that big of a deal.
100 years. I can't believe it.
How is that all you have to say, Aang? All your friends are dead. Maybe I'm being kind of harsh. It's just always been a bit of a plot hole for me. Like I said, I'll get into this more later, but yeah. Overall, The Boy in the Iceberg is a perfectly serviceable introduction to this world and characters, and let's move on. Oh no, wait, sorry. One more thing. I'm gonna be doing an MVP for each episode, you know? I thought that would be a fun little segment. So the MVP for The Boy in the Iceberg is Katara. Okay, now we can move on. So if you're watching The Avatar Returns on Netflix or something, and not as the second half of the two-parter it was originally aired as, you're going to be spoilt that Aang is the Avatar in the opening credits. Like, obviously we know that Aang is the Avatar, it's literally in the title of the show, but you still have to admit that's kind of funny. Anyway, The Avatar Returns follows on right from where The Boy in the Iceberg left off. And I'd say that this is basically on the same level as the previous episode. We begin with Aang and Katara returning to the village after springing that booby trap, and something I really like throughout this episode is how Sokka is portrayed. See, it would have been easy to write this guy as merely a comic relief character, you know, someone who thinks he's this brave soldier, but who the show constantly belittles and emasculates. And sure, we do have moments which lean into this direction. For example, all the stuff with his watchtower, but the show does in fact simultaneously present Sokka right from the beginning as a legitimately courageous, intelligent, resourceful, strong-willed, and capable warrior. And this isn't even accounting for all the excellent character development the guy experiences throughout these 3 seasons. I love the fact that his authority within the Southern Water Tribe is clearly respected, both by his sister and grandmother. Like, for example, when he banishes Aang, which, from his perspective, was probably the correct thing to do. Sure, Katara disagrees with him and gets annoyed, but he isn't laughed at or humiliated. He even says himself that he's only fulfilling the promise he made to his father when he left to go fight in the war. And this isn't even mentioning what is surely my favourite moment in the entire episode, which is when Zuko's ship crashes into the village, and we get just this incredible shot of this 15-year-old warrior just completely standing his ground. It's powerful stuff, man. And yeah, Sokka is not going to be a match for a firebender 1 year older than him, probably trained by his nation's best teachers. But again, it's not portrayed as this embarrassing moment for Sokka. Sure, there's comedy in there, but it also emphasizes his bravery against basically impossible odds. And the guy is even in the end able to get a boomerang headshot in. And yeah, the boomerang is a bit of a meme, the show makes fun of it multiple times. But if we're being honest, I think it serves as a really great symbol for Sokka's character and fighting spirit. Being a weapon which is, yes, a bit goofy and may not instantly seem like a threat, but which will in the end always come back around, proving its worthiness as a versatile, reliable, and effective tool. Anyway, Aang eventually returns to the village and essentially turns himself in, revealing that 1, he is the Avatar.
What? Nah, I never knew that.
And 2, that he is a pretty compassionate and selfless bloke. I love this really small moment where Aang is smiling at Katara, you know, insinuating that it's all gonna be okay, before immediately changing to a face of worry the second his head is out of sight. It's pretty powerful. And just the warning, Avatar is so good at these smaller, more subtle moments that, yes, I will continue to praise them throughout this whole video. Moving on, and one thing I used to find a bit strange when I was younger is how Aang is able to so effortlessly beat all of the guards in Zuko's ship. Like, sure, he's an airbending prodigy, but surely it's still kind of unrealistic. Until I realized that, hold on a second, no one's fought an airbender in 100 years. Of course Aang is going to have a huge advantage in basically every fight. And it's really cool to watch airbending in action. It's probably my favorite element both in terms of the culture and fighting style, with the latter being greatly inspired by Baguazhang, a real-life martial art with a strong connection to Taoism, which is, to put it very simply, a philosophy about embracing the natural flow of existence and cultivating a balanced, spontaneous life, which definitely fits into the whole air nomad vibe. Very good world building there. And during this fight, we get this moment where Aang is looking for his staff, and he comes upon Iroh, who is sleeping in his quarters. And this is something I've always thought about quite a lot. Obviously, we know that by this point in the story, Iroh is a good guy and a very spiritual man who would never actually want to hurt the Avatar. To be honest, I get the impression that the only reason he's on the boat at all, still wearing Fire Nation colours, is to keep an eye on Zuko and to, subtly nudge him over time into a more wholesome and peaceful direction. So I used to theorize that Iroh, in all his infinite wisdom, was only pretending to be asleep so that the Avatar could get away. But now I actually think that's kind of a stupid theory, mainly because I think it's clear that, yes, while at this point in the story Iroh was a good guy who had all this depth to him, I don't think he was necessarily this way in the minds of the writers yet, which is why later on in the episode we see Iroh straight up trying to murder 3 children and their pet bison. I love the sentences analysing this show produces. Aang and Zuko's fight is pretty compelling, especially this moment. And then we of course get Aang going into the Avatar state for the first time, accompanied with Jeremy Zuckerman's absolutely iconic score. I literally get chills every time I hear it. Katara is able to cleverly use her at this point subpar waterbending to take out the Fire Nation guards, and we even get a great Sokka moment where he pokes Zuko off the ship, a nice callback to earlier on in the episode. We finish with Katara, Sokka and Aang flying away on Appa, and something I only just picked up on this time round is this very small moment where Aang is talking about how he never wanted to be the Avatar. Classic stuff you deal with when you're 12 years old. But just watch this bit here.
I never wanted to be.
I love this. It's so minuscule, but perfectly symbolizes the darkness of the current state of the world, but also the little shimmer of light which the Avatar's return has obviously brought back. It's just neat stuff. Oh yeah, and the MVP for the Avatar Returns is obviously Sokka. I think the Southern Air Temple is the most fitting episode for me to properly explain some of my problems with the lore of Avatar The Last Airbender, especially with the Air Nomad genocide, and how it relates to the present story being told. We're gonna start with the A plot where these inconsistencies arise, before talking about the B plot with Zuko, which in my opinion is the much better executed half of this episode. So we begin with Aang, Katara and Sokka, who from this point onwards I'm just gonna refer to as Team Avatar, preparing to depart from their camp and set off for the Southern Air Temple. And hold on, wouldn't this be the first time Katara and Sokka are seeing trees or greenery of any kind? They could have made a reference to this, but it's not the end of the world. Anyway, the rest of this plot is Team Avatar exploring the Southern Air Temple. Katara and Sokka trying to be empathetic and delicate towards Aang and the whole thing about his entire race being genocided, Aang finding Monk Gyatso's body and getting really angry, Katara calming him down, and finally the addition of Momo to the team. And I do like all of this. I think it was a really wise decision to address what happened to the Airbenders right away, before we get into the run of one-off episodic adventures, which take up the majority of Book 1. I adore seeing Aang's flashbacks with Monk Gyatso, seeing what the temple was like before the genocide, seeing how wonderful of a place it was. Honestly, it was these flashbacks throughout the series which first got me interested in the idea of monks and monasteries and why people would live like this, eventually leading to my own personal spiritual journey as I got into stuff like Buddhism, so thanks Avatar for changing my life forever. However, with that all being said, I don't think that, as a whole, the Air Nomad genocide and its ramifications throughout this story are written very well. And this is something that I alluded to when talking about episode 1, but I think right now I'm just going to vent all my problems surrounding it so that we can move on, because honestly it's probably my only somewhat sizable flaw with the whole show. So first of all, the reasons behind the Air Nomad genocide don't really make sense to me. I mean, obviously no genocide makes sense to me, it's genocide, but you know what I mean. We see in the incredible season 3 episode, The Avatar and the Fire Lord, that Sozin's justification for quote-unquote wiping out the air temples was due to the fact that he knew the Avatar would be reborn into the Air Nomads. But surely he doesn't actually want to kill the Avatar, right? As they would just be reborn into the water tribes and then you'd have to start all over again. So I assume Sozin gave strict instructions to all firebenders to not kill the Avatar, but merely to capture him. I mean, this is never really made clear, but surely the goal was not to just blindly murder every airbender. However, in this world, tradition dictates that the Avatar only be told they are the Avatar when they turn 16. But this genocide took place only 12 years after Roku's death. And sure, Aang happens to have been told when he was 12 due to the Fire Nation's increased hostility, but Sozin wouldn't have known that. Honestly, I think the only way that the Air Nomads genocide makes a semblance of sense is if we assume that Sozin, in all his arrogance, didn't actually care about capturing the Avatar, and instead saw massacring all the airbenders as a way of restarting the cycle once again, effectively giving the Fire Nation at least 16 more years to establish their dominance across the globe. And perhaps this is why we see later on in the Puppet Master that the Fire Nation eventually became obsessed with rounding up all the southern water tribes' waterbenders, maybe in the hope of finding their next avatar in the cycle. I think when it comes to headcanon, that's what makes the most amount of sense. It's never really made clear in the show, but sure. However, let's be honest with each other here. I think the real reason we have the Air Nomads genocide is because it's a plot device, included to 1. Make us hate the Fire Nation, 2. To provide Aang with some extra emotion and depth, and 3. To have Aang be the last airbender. Now, to be honest, I think the first 2 reasons on that list could have been just as prevalent without the need for a genocide, but it is basically the only way you could have made Aang the last airbender, so fine. At the end of the day, this isn't some huge complaint. I don't think it breaks the show or anything, and yes, I know that Avatar is just a kids show and probably shouldn't be held under such intense scrutiny, but when you have a series which is so masterfully written, something like the Air Nomads genocide and its surrounding lore is gonna stick out a bit. The second thing I want to talk about is the ramifications the Air Nomads genocide has on the current story, specifically how other characters react to and treat Aang both as an airbender and as the Avatar. So I believe I'm right in saying that everyone in the Avatar world knows about the Air Nomads genocide, right? I assume this stuff was taught in schools, I assume Katara and Sokka know, but when Team Avatar are flying to the Southern Air Temple, no one seems to tell Aang straight up what happened. Instead, we get stuff like this.
I just want you to be prepared for what you might see. The Fire Nation is ruthless. They killed my mother. They could have done the same to your people.
You know they did, Katara. You know the Fire Nation killed all the airbenders. No one's seen one for 100 years. That's a long time. And then when Team Avatar arrive at the temple, yeah, Aang is upset about how much things have changed, but it's not like he's asking, where are the airbenders? Where are the sky bison? Where is everyone, guys? In fact, after a brief moment of sorrow, he seems relatively chill about everything. Then Katara and Sokka see a Fire Nation helmet.
Fire Nation.
We should tell him.
Oh, so I guess they weren't taught about the Air Nomad genocide. Yeah, this officially does not make sense to me. Again, I'm not trying to nitpick. I understand that it was originally meant for kids, and I understand that if you scrutinize any story enough, flaws will begin to emerge. But yeah. In the otherwise airtight writing of this show, this is something which I've always found kind of confusing, if we're being honest. Of course, the other big thing which happens in this episode is that Aang enters the Avatar state, triggering all those statues to glow and sending some sort of spiritual message out to the other 3 nations that the Avatar has returned. And this scene is really powerful. I love seeing the different Avatar temples, especially the Earth one containing the mural of 5, which depicts past Earth Kingdom avatars, including Kyoshi on the right there. Again, it's so cool seeing stuff like this. It really helps flesh out the lore of the world. But what's not really clear, and this is going to be the third and final prong of my Air Nomad genocide and Aang's return criticism trident, is whether this incredibly important piece of news became public to everyone. Because sure, the people at each of these Avatar temples find out that their Lord and Savior has returned. We see the Fire Sage demand that word be sent to the Fire Lord, and we have to assume that the other sages also sent a message to their head of state. But did the Avatar's return become common knowledge to everyone? Well, I'd love to answer that question for you, but I don't know. The show is kind of inconsistent about it. See, some people seem to be aware that the Avatar has returned, and some people don't. Some people make a big fuss upon meeting Aang, yet others are pretty chill about it. And the only reason why I'm mentioning this is because I feel like Aang's return is a huge deal, right? He is basically the messiah of this world, but often people's reactions to the Last Airbender, the last hope for defeating the fascist government hellbent on taking over the globe, is just, oh hey, you're the Avatar. You know what I mean? For such a well-written show, for such a big plot point within the series, it is kind of glossed over. Luckily, it's only really an issue in the first season, as by episode 16, the Avatar's return is clearly common knowledge to everyone, as we even see wanted posters for Aang, but I just thought I'd mention this as the whole air nomad genocide and the world's reaction to the Avatar's return has always struck me as a bit weird and inconsistent. Maybe I'm just being pedantic though, I don't know, let me know what you think in the comment section. Anyway, despite my problems on the ramifications of this episode, as a whole, this A-plot with Team Avatar is pretty good, pretty powerful. But the B-plot with Zuko and Iroh is where I really think this episode shines. We of course get the introduction to Captain Zhao.
It's Commander now.
Oh, sorry, Commander Zhao, who is gonna act as a pretty compelling villain to both Zuko and Team Avatar throughout this first season. And it's interesting watching this episode back, because when I first saw this show, yeah, I felt sympathy for Zuko, but I never really liked him, at least not until probably the second season. However, nowadays I am literally rooting for him from the moment he first comes on screen. And this episode only increases my feelings on the guy, as Zhao taunts him about the Avatar, taunts him about his father, and eventually pushes Zuko to challenge him to an Agni Kai, which is essentially a firebending duel, and is a really good piece of world building when it comes to the Fire Nation's views on power, tradition, and respect. The actual Agni Kai itself is really cool, but of course the best moment in the episode comes when the defeated Zhao goes for the dishonorable, cheap shot on Zuko, and Iroh just completely puts him in his place, once again alluding to his wisdom and power. It is such good writing, and it of course earns Iroh the MVP for this episode. Anyway, that's gonna be it. I spoke for a long time there, so let's move on. So, the Warriors of Kyoshi begins what is, in my opinion, a kind of weak 3-episode run in this first season. Again, I have to preface, it's not that these next few episodes are bad, per se, it's just that when you've seen Avatar The Last Airbender as many times as I have, you've kind of already gotten everything you're gonna get out of them, if that makes sense. Like, let's be real. I'm never gonna get bored at rewatching The Storm, or Zuko Alone, or the Firebending Masters, but The Warriors of Kyoshi, by the 10th rewatch, yeah, I get it. However, I will say this episode does start off with a pretty funny joke.
How am I gonna find him, Uncle? He is clearly a master of evasive maneuvering.
You have no idea where you're going, do you?
Before we get Sokka making some sexist comments, which I'd argue is like the main theme for this episode, with him eventually learning that women can fight too, and that sexism is wrong. Which is, of course, a good message to have in a kids show, but unlike a lot of the other trickier, more mature subjects Avatar famously deals with throughout its 3 seasons, I don't think this one is really dealt with much nuance or subtlety. And I would say in general that these next few episodes very much bring you back down to reality and remind you that this show was originally aired on Nickelodeon. In fact, it's kind of crazy to think that the people behind the Warriors of Kyoshi or the King of Omashu also brought us Appa's Lost Days and the Tales of Ba Sing Se. But that's not to say that this episode doesn't have great moments. I love this bit where Zuko hears about the Avatar's whereabouts through the delivery of a fish, very subtly conveying the cooperation these warring nations still need to have. We also get the introduction to Foaming Mouth Guy, who is in my opinion just an incredible example of Avatar's surreal humor, which completely comes out of nowhere. The rest of the episode is pretty standard. Sokka gets humbled and learns to respect women, Zuko attacks the island, and Team Avatar escape. However, we do get an example of one of my all-time favourite tropes in fiction, which is of course the taming of the beast which defeated you in the first act trope. It's so badass, it's such a cool scene, and for that reason alone, Aang gets the MVP for this episode. Sorry, Foaming Mouth Guy. And that's basically it for the Warriors of Kyoshi. I don't think there's anything or anyone I have not mentioned. Oh yeah, I guess we can talk about Suki. She's alright, she's fine, we'll talk about her more later, but I guess my opinion is that if the writers were going to include Suki as more than just a one-off character, and especially if they were going to include her as a member of Team Avatar, they should have given her way more attention across the show, because honestly, she just doesn't have that much of a personality or character. Yes, obviously when compared to the rest of Team Avatar, but even when compared to other side characters such as Mei or Ty Lee. Don't get me wrong, Suki has good moments in this episode and later on, but she's definitely one of the show's more forgettable side characters for me. Sorry. The King of Omashu definitely continues the juvenile Nickelodeon vibe from the Warriors of Kyoshi. However, we do of course in this episode meet an absolute fan favourite side character. I am of course referring to the Cabbage Merchant. And yeah, I'll admit, it's a funny joke. I think the reason why the Cabbage Merchant works so well is that he only appears 4 times, I believe. I can imagine if the writers decided to just put him in every other episode, it would get really stale really quickly. But luckily they were able to show some discipline, and that's why the joke works every single time. Anyway, talking about the actual episode, Team Avatar go to Omashu, which is a really well-designed and memorable city. I can see why they brought it back next season. There's this thing where Aang has to wear a disguise so he's not spotted, and it's like the only time he does this, at least in Earth Kingdom territory, throughout the whole show, which, again, kind of links to my perceived inconsistencies around the whole "do people know that the Avatar has returned" thing. But anyway, they mess around in Omashu for a bit before of course meeting King Bumi, who I like. He's not my favourite of the White Lotus. I'm personally more of a Zhong and Master Piandao guy, but he is a pretty good character, who has a similar dynamic to Iroh in terms of being a pretty chill, funny guy, but who also has this incredibly disciplined, powerful, and wise layer which hides just underneath the surface, if that makes sense. But anyway, most of the episode is Aang having to do these trials about seeing things differently or whatever, and yeah, it's fine. Again, I get strong Nickelodeon young adult vibes from the whole thing, although I will say that the cough sound effects they do after certain jokes is kind of hilarious.
Oh, Kangaroo Island, eh? I hear that place is really hopping.
It gives me strong Edgar Wright vibes, but yeah. Overall, The King of Omashu is probably one of the weakest episodes of the entire show for me, but it's not without its funny moments, while containing some solid world building and introducing us to Bumi, who I'll give the MVP to. I really like how Imprisoned opens. We get some beautiful background paintings of the forest Team Avatar are camping in, as well as those trademark kalimba sounds. On a side note, I feel like half of all kalimba sales these days are to people who just want to play peaceful Avatar music. But yeah, even in the weaker episodes, this show does such a good job at creating atmosphere. We also get this pretty funny moment with Sokka and his nuts.
And I bet that village has a market!
Which means no nuts for dinner!
Hey, I worked hard to get those nuts. Yeah, I hate him too.
Sokka and Momo's relationship is one of the best on the whole show. Change my mind. Anyway, Team Avatar meets Haru, this moustacheless earthbender. That joke will make sense later. And he talks with Katara a bit, and she does the thing where she touches her necklace and talks about her mother. I know there's been a bit of a pushback against all the memes about this, but honestly, I stand by it. I think it's hilarious. I think some people take this stuff a little too seriously. Then we're introduced to the most hated character in the entire Avatar The Last Airbender fandom. This guy. I don't think he has a name, but he snitches on Haru for earthbending after the guy saved his life. Team Avatar do this kind of hilarious prank to get Katara arrested, and she's sent to prison. Now, something which is very subtly referenced here is that the earthbenders cannot escape the prison because it's made entirely of metal. This is something which is mentioned time and time again in these first 2 seasons, and it's pretty good foreshadowing for what is to come. Anyway, the best thing about this episode is Katara's hope and unrelenting optimism. Her speech to the earthbenders is actually pretty inspiring, and the moment they actually revolt against the firebenders is wholesome, although we can all agree that Haru's dad just killed those guards, right? I mean, he said that cowards float, but yeah, not when they're wearing armor. He straight up murdered those people. Anyway, the MVP of this episode is obviously Katara, and let's move on. Okay, we finally made it to the Winter Solstice 2-parter, where I think Avatar The Last Airbender becomes Avatar The Last Airbender. Like, this is really where things start to get developed, where it starts to feel like more than just a well-written kids show. We open with Team Avatar finding a forest which has been burnt down, and I really like how affected Aang is by this. It really ties into the idea that this show is about more than just humans, you know? There is great emphasis throughout the series on animals and nature, how they have also been affected by the Fire Nation, and how large-scale positive change, both in the Avatar world and our own, it needs to be holistic. It needs to be in the best interest of all living things, not just Homo sapiens. Anyway, eventually Aang finds himself having to protect a nearby village against an angry spirit, and hold on. Is this the first time we've been told about spirits in this show? I'm pretty sure it is, and I think it says a lot about the subtle spiritual mood of the first 6 episodes that it's not really a surprise to hear that spirits just exist in this world. Eventually Aang starts fighting Heibai, who looks like something straight out of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I love how Sokka just runs out to help him with his boomerang. Such a great character moment for him, although unfortunately he does get taken straight away, which is pretty funny. Aang goes after Sokka, but accidentally enters the spirit world where he realizes bending does not work, before being greeted by a spirit dragon, and at this point, I'm sold on this series. You know, this is some hardcore, psychedelic, Grateful Dead level stuff. Anyway, the dragon takes Aang, who voiced some concerns earlier on in the episode about being the Avatar, to Roku's old fire temple place. And before we go any further, let's really quickly talk about the B-plot, where Iroh basically falls asleep and is captured by Earth Kingdom warriors. I believe this is where we learn about Iroh's nickname, the Dragon of the West, which is just such a cool name, man. Oh my god, it's so cool. Anyway, on the way to wherever they were gonna take him, Aang flies by on Roku's dragon. However, Iroh sees it. He's able to see the invisible spirits which no one else could. It's a blink and you miss it occurrence, but it's honestly my favourite moment of the whole episode. Such great character building and foreshadowing. Anyway, Aang learns that he has to go to Roku's temple for some important information involving a comet. He then returns to the village and shows Heibai that the forest will grow back, and Heibai in turn brings everyone back, including Sokka, and turns into a panda. It's a nice, wholesome, full circle ending, as is the Zuko-Iroh B-plot. First of all, we have this moment where the Avatar-obsessed Zuko chooses saving Iroh over following Appa, nice one Zuko, and then Zuko actually saving Iroh.
Excellent form, Prince Zuko.
You taught me well.
That's such a great moment, man. It's such an interesting dynamic because these are basically the bad guys fighting the good guys, yet we want them to win. It just goes to show how well written these two characters are. Anyway, because of that amazing spirit dragon moment, I have to give the MVP to Iroh for this episode. Winter Solstice Part 2 Avatar Roku is probably the best episode of the show so far. After a pretty intense scene where both Team Avatar and Team Zuko, I guess we'll call them, get past the Fire Nation blockade, they finally all make it to Roku's temple, which we'd actually already seen in the 3rd episode when that sage was like, "The Avatar has returned!" And I really like this moment where the sages start attacking Team Avatar, but there's this one nice sage who wants to help them, and Sokka's just having none of it. You know, he says firebenders are not our friends, and the guy has to like bow down to prove his allegiance. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely tons of better examples of this show humanizing the enemy, I guess, and illustrating that the world is more complicated than all firebenders are evil, but it's still a nice introduction to that idea, let's say. I also really like the explanation that the sages aren't just evil because they're firebenders, but because they lost hope that the Avatar would ever return, and eventually started following Ozai instead. Again, good writing and world building, and foreshadows Aang's guilt which he deals with throughout the show. Anyway, after some hijinks with Zuko, Aang gets into Roku's shrine room, and he has a little chat with his past self about how Sozin's comet is coming back, and that he needs to master all the elements and defeat the Fire Lord before he destroys the world or whatever. It's such a cool scene though, honestly. I love all the trippy spiritual Avatar stuff in this show, and the music is so epic. I think it's some sort of Mongolian throat singing, and it just works, man. Eventually, Roku emerges from the shrine room and lets everyone escape, including Zuko, which is really interesting. He burns Zuko's chains and lets him go free, either because he knows that he has a part to play in this story, or because, of course, they are related. Roku is Zuko's great-grandfather, I believe, so yeah, I don't know if that was planned at the time, but it's great foreshadowing nonetheless. We also see lava bending for the first time, which is pretty cool, and the episode ends with this beautiful shot of Team Avatar flying in the moonlight. As for the MVP of this episode, I guess we'll give it to Roku. The Waterbending Scroll is a slight step back from the previous episode in my opinion, but it's still decent. We open with Aang stressing about how he has to master all the elements, and Katara decides to teach him all the waterbending that she knows. Now, I haven't really mentioned this, but throughout the first half of this season, we have seen Katara very slowly get better at waterbending. And I do think that for the most part, Avatar does a pretty good job at presenting the patience and discipline one needs in order to get better at a skill. It's an important lesson to teach, especially for kids, and one which most fiction, but especially fantasy fiction, usually just ignores. However, in this episode we also see the sometimes harsh reality of talent, and I think it's done really well. But before that, I have to shout out this great Sokka moment.
So, while you guys are playing in the water, I'm supposed to be hard at work picking mud out of a giant bison's feet?
Mud and bugs.
Okay.
Anyway, eventually Team Avatar meet these pirates, and I think Aang trying to haggle for the scroll is genuinely hilarious.
Say to the price of 1 copper piece.
I don't know, man. Zachary Tyler Ison's inflections for Aang just always crack me up. We also, of course, get the return of the cabbage merchant while the pirates are chasing Team Avatar for stealing the scroll, and Katara being jealous of Aang's waterbending talent. I mean, he is like the messiah, to be fair, but still, it's gotta sting how easily he picks it up. The episode climaxes in the pirates, Team Avatar, and Team Zuko all having a big showdown, which is honestly one of the most entertaining fights we've gotten so far in this show. There's a ton of great moments here, like this line from Iroh.
Aang, this is all my fault.
No, Katara, it isn't.
Yeah, it kind of is.
Sokka intelligently turning everyone against each other, and of course the bit where Aang airbends away the smoke before realizing he's surrounded. And something I think Avatar does so well is the power balance between characters, because realistically, people who can control fire should be able to easily beat a bunch of pirates with swords and smoke bombs, but they choreograph the fight scene throughout this show in a pretty clever way, where everyone, most of the time, is on a somewhat even playing field. Obviously, if the show was in live action and was aiming for a more serious tone, this wouldn't really work at all, but for what Avatar is trying to be, they nail it. Anyway, eventually Aang and Katara do the same waterbending move they were practicing right at the start of the episode to get away. It's a nice full circle moment which actually comes even more full circle in the final episode of the entire show, but we'll get to that later. As Team Avatar flee the scene, we get this hilarious interaction between Zuko and Iroh.
Are you so busy fighting you cannot see your own ship has set sail?
We have no time for your proverbs, Uncle.
It's no proverb. Maybe it should be a proverb.
Before one final fight on the boats where Katara finally does the water whip and Momo defeats the iguana parrot. Oh yeah, I haven't mentioned this yet, but pretty much every animal in this world is a combination of 2 animals. It's pretty funny. Eventually Team Avatar escape using the bison whistle Aang had bought earlier in the episode, while Iroh realizes that the white lotus tile he had lost was in his pocket the whole time. I wonder if that tile will have any significance moving forward. Anyway, the MVP for this episode goes to Aang for just being a legend. Oh boy, it's Jet. Definitely one of the worst episodes in the entire show for me. It is perhaps the episode which most radiates that Nickelodeon young adult vibe which the show will soon just completely get rid of, despite of course introducing Jet, who does end up having some depth and significance in the next season, as well as the rest of the freedom fighters, including the GOAT Longshot. I'm a big Longshot defender, guys. Everything going on in this particular episode feels incredibly one-note and cliche. However, I do think it is slightly redeemed by Sokka just being an overall legend. I believe this is the first episode where he is fully responsible for bringing home the W. All the stuff with his instincts is pretty funny, and of course, he gets the MVP. Oh boy, it's the Great Divide. Probably the most infamous episode of Avatar The Last Airbender for basically being the only filler episode in the entire show. Like, sure, the Tales of Ba Sing Se would also technically count as filler, but that episode does so much character building that you can't really call it that. The Great Divide, on the other hand, does absolutely nothing. The creators of Avatar, Brian Konietzko and Michael Dante DiMartino, went as far as to call the episode terrible, and even made fun of it later on in the show during the Ember Island players. However, one cool bit of information I found is that Jianzu, a character from the Kyoshi books, which you should definitely read by the way, they're really good, he's actually from the Ganjin tribe, so there you go. World building. Anyway, the MVP goes to Sokka for being completely correct about the tarps. Yeah, that's right, I said it. The Storm is easily the best episode of the show so far. Nothing even comes close. It is also one of the most important episodes of the whole show, as it is here where we learn much of the backstories to Avatar The Last Airbender's 2 best and most integral characters, Zuko and Aang. Now, while the themes of guilt, responsibility, honor, and redemption in The Storm are very complex, the way the writers decided to convey these themes is actually pretty simple, with the structure of the episode basically just being Aang explaining his past to Katara, while Iroh explains Zuko's past to the crew of their ship. However, what makes The Storm so incredible is how the episode seamlessly cuts between these two tales, both visually with the imagery of the two fires, but more importantly in regards to thematic structure, driving home the parallels between Aang and Zuko's characters and seriously enriching the stakes of both their arcs. However, before we get into any of that, we need to talk about how this episode opens, with Aang having some visually stunning, guilt-ridden nightmare involving Monk Gyatso, before we get this shot for just a few frames of Fire Lord Ozai. It's a pretty powerful way to open an episode. I also love Iroh being wise enough to realize that a storm is coming despite the clear sky. Yes, I am going to mention every single moment of Iroh subtly revealing he knows more than he lets on, because it's just that well executed. We also have this subplot about Zuko not respecting his crew, which will come full circle by the end of the episode, but what I really want to discuss is this fisherman, who I feel like is one of the only characters throughout the entire show who actually has a realistic reaction to seeing Aang, because he's not ecstatic about meeting the Avatar like Katara assumes he's going to be. No, instead he says,
"Well, don't be so smiley about it. The Avatar disappeared for 100 years. You turned your back on the world."
Now look, I'm not saying I would invite this guy to my birthday party or whatever, but I do think it makes sense for him to harbour these feelings towards the Avatar, and I do kind of wish more characters throughout the series were like this, because pretty much no one else who meets Aang seems to question his disappearance or responsibility to the world. Anyway, Aang glides away because he feels so guilty about abandoning everyone. Katara flies after him, and this is where we get into the main crux of the episode, where we learn about Aang and Zuko's backstories. I do think it's kind of weird that Sokka and/or Katara never questioned Aang about why they found him in an iceberg, but anyway. Aang's story opens with a flashback of him at the Air Temple, and it's really sad to see all these blissfully unaware kids who were just a few days away from being brutally murdered by fascist firebenders. Sorry to bring the mood down, but yeah, it's powerful. We witness Aang learning that he is the Avatar before cutting to Zuko's ship, and I love that the show actually gives a voice to the crew here. Eventually Iroh sits them all down and starts telling them a story, and man, the second it fades to a scarless Zuko, you know that stuff is about to go down. I also love this white sheen all the flashbacks have in this episode. It's a nice touch. Throughout Iroh's tale, we see how happy Zuko used to be, as well as learning a lot about the culture of the Fire Nation, how much emphasis they place on etiquette and respect. And I think it's quite a big deal that Zuko gets in trouble not for doing anything inherently evil, but just for speaking out of turn. In fact, as Iroh notes, what he was saying was actually correct, and it's such a great way of painting the Fire Nation not as simply a collection of evil, moustache-twirling villains, but an institution and culture which is rotten to its core. Hashtag escape the culture. Anyway, Aang doesn't want to be the Avatar. He overhears that he's going to be sent away from Monk Gyatso, and he's understandably angry. I mean, the guy is 12 years old, for God's sake. So he leaves. And I think this is all executed so perfectly. It makes sense that Aang would run away. You do not blame him for it. But on the other hand, it's not like his guilt is completely unjustified, you know? It's not like what the fisherman was saying about him running away from his responsibilities is completely untrue. Because, well, he did run away. Not only does this increase our understanding and empathy towards Aang, you know, making us realize that he is more than just a simple, good-natured kid and that there's actually quite a lot of trauma there, but it also brilliantly sets up the stakes for his eventual redemption. And this is all juxtaposed with the scene where Zuko has to face off against his father, who we of course only see as a silhouette and hear through Mark Hamill's incredible voice acting. And honestly, the moment where Zuko gets his face burnt is probably the most harrowing thing in the whole show. I've watched it so many times, but I still get goosebumps. We also get to see Azula for the first time, which is pretty interesting. Just look at her face, man. What a psychopath. Anyway, we then get to one of my favorite moments in the whole episode, which is this cut right here.
The Avatar gives Zuko hope.
I love the image of Zuko sat meditating by himself while everyone else on the ship talks about him, as well as the further flashbacks to his childhood and mother, which reveal even more depth and mystery to his character. Anyway, the rest is a pretty standard Avatar The Last Airbender full circle third act, with Aang saving the fisherman who slagged him off for shirking his responsibilities, Zuko saving the crew member who slagged him off for being selfish. It's all pretty great stuff, however there are two specific moments in particular I have to shout out. The first one being Iroh redirecting lightning. What? I'm sure that will never come up again. And the other, of course, being that look Aang and Zuko give each other. Ooh, are they really that different after all? Keep watching to find out. Seriously though, incredible episode. I've heard before that the storm is where Avatar: The Last Airbender reveals itself to be the truly special piece of art we all now know it is, and yeah, I can see why people say that. It's 23 minutes of masterful storytelling and character development, and the MVP is going to have to be shared between Aang and Zuko for this one. I don't think it's a coincidence that the blue spirit comes right after the storm. This is once again a very Aang and Zuko-centered episode, with a now Admiral Zhao capturing Aang and Zuko kind of being forced to help and rescue him because he's got to be the one to deliver the Avatar to Ozai. But while the blue spirit of course does not hit the same heights as the previous episode in terms of thematic weight and character development, it makes up for this with its action and choreography, which is some of the best of the whole season. It is here where we first get to see Zuko's skills with dual broadswords, as well as his creativity when it comes to fighting, which is interesting because up until this point he's mainly been, you know, angry firebender who yells every time he attacks someone. The brilliant subtlety of his character and backstory hasn't exactly been translated when it comes to the subtlety of his fighting technique. However, that is all changed here, as we see him do no firebending across the whole episode. I imagine because he doesn't want Zhao nor the audience to know his true identity, but also because he clearly doesn't need his firebending as much as we initially presumed. My favourite example of this is when he throws a bucket of water to extinguish a guard's fire blasts. It's so cool and creative. Of course, eventually Aang and Zuko, or sorry, the blue spirit, are able to escape, with Aang realizing that the blue spirit is in fact Zuko.
Whoa. Nah, I never knew that. I never knew that.
And deciding to save him anyway. And I love that Aang doesn't just ditch him in the forest, but actually stays with him and tries to talk to him about their potential future friendship. And I also love how Zuko, despite trying to attack Aang, clearly remembers this conversation and references it 2 seasons later. This is good writing, ladies and gentlemen, and a pretty good episode, especially like I said when it comes to the action scenes. Oh yeah, we also have this B-plot with Sokka, Katara, and Momo, which is kind of just there for filler, I guess, as well as Iroh beautifully playing the Sungi horn next to a monkey statue, both purchases he made 4 episodes earlier. It's a nice little Easter egg. Anyway, I kind of wanted to give the MVP to Zhao for this one because I do genuinely think he's a solid villain, and Jason Isaacs does a great job with his voice. However, let's be real, the MVP here is Zuko. I can see how some would call the Fortuneteller just another filler episode. However, I would disagree, as it does serve to sow the seeds for the eventual romance that blossoms between Aang and Katara. Like, sure, there were subtle hints earlier on in the season, but this is the only episode of Book 1 Water where it is outright brought up. And it is here where I need to share perhaps my first truly hot take of this whole video. So, here it goes. I think Aang and Katara's relationship is one of the best things about the entire show. Yeah, that's right. You thought I was gonna slag Katang off, didn't you? Like all these children on the internet talking about how the relationship is too forced and vanilla, and that Katara should have ended up with Zuko. I mean, what are you, 13 years old? Get your nose out of the young adult section at your local bookshop and step into the real world. Okay, sorry, that got out of hand. To be honest, I don't know if it's even considered a hot take to really like Aang and Katara together, but occasionally I will see people on the internet claiming that the relationship is one of the show's weak points, and clearly this is not a notion I can get on board with. Personally, I think the romance which blossoms between Aang and Katara throughout these 3 seasons is incredibly well executed. I love how organic it feels, I love how it plays into the other aspects of the 2 characters' pretty intense but nuanced relationship, as well as their individual arcs, and to be honest, I do see it as one of the most cathartic, profound, and heartfelt storylines of the entire show, which is interesting considering how most of it is, especially in the first 2 seasons, kind of just simmering away in the show's subtext, you know? It's more subtle than most of Avatar: The Last Airbender's other plot points, and I think this may explain why I only really started to appreciate what the show was doing with Aang and Katara once I got a bit older. But more on that later, as at least for now at the start of this episode, the romance is pretty one-sided, with Aang making a necklace for Katara.
Maybe instead of saving the world, you can go into the jewelry making business.
I don't see why I can't do both.
I've always loved that line. Before Katara says this about Aang.
Stop teasing him, Sokka. Aang's just a good friend. A sweet little guy. Just like Momo.
Oh no, Aang. Oh, I feel that deep in my chest. My boy got pet zoned. We then meet, honestly, one of my favourite one-off unnamed characters in the whole show. This guy. Look how casual and zen he is dodging that platypus bear. Anyway, he tells them about Aunt Wu, the titular Fortuneteller, so Team Avatar make their way to the nearby village for some clairvoyant shenanigans, and look. It's not the most high-stakes stuff in the series, and I can see why the Fortuneteller is not everyone's favourite episode, but I do actually think it's incredibly watchable, mainly due to its humour. This episode always gets a ton of laughs out of me, for example this moment.
Looks like someone had a pretty good bathroom break.
Yeah, when I was in there.
I don't even want to know.
Or when Aunt Wu tells Aang he's going to be in some epic battle which will determine the fate of the world, and Aang is just really bored by the whole thing because, well, he knows all about his impending duel with the Fire Lord already. Again, it's just such surprisingly subversive and clever humour for a kids show. We also here meet Meng, who has a little crush on Aang, and I can't believe I didn't realise this until now, but she's actually voiced by Michaela Jill Murphy, who will definitely not return in future seasons to voice anyone else. Anyway, we then have Aang trying to court Katara,
Hey, Katara!
which yields a ton of hilarious moments, too many to include in this video, but I would feel wrong not shouting out what is easily one of my most quoted lines from the whole show.
So, papaya.
I don't know why, but this just cracks me up every single time, and I still think about it whenever I see a papaya, which is more often than you'd think. Eventually Aang and Katara have to bend the clouds because a volcano is going to destroy the village or whatever. A nice callback to episode 7 where they learnt that clouds are made of water, before we get this amazing scene where Aang defeats said volcano, both showing Roku how it's done and prompting Katara to think, now hold on a second, this guy's a pretty powerful bender. Aunt Wu said I would marry a powerful bender. Maybe, just maybe, things will turn out a certain way. That's all I'm saying. And of course we end with a nice message about shaping your own destiny, which wraps everything up very well. I'm gonna be real with you guys, The Fortuneteller is not one of the best episodes of Avatar's first season, but it is, in my opinion, far from the worst. And the MVP is obviously Aang. Bato of the Water Tribe is an episode which is often criticised for how weird and out of character everyone acts, especially Aang, and while I do agree with this sentiment and it is something we will touch upon, that doesn't mean this episode has zero redeeming qualities. For example, this is a great Sokka episode. Here we get quite a few flashbacks of when the men of the Southern Water Tribe, including Hakoda, Sokka and Katara's father, left to go fight in the war, and honestly, I find it really powerful. It adds a ton of depth to someone who at this point is still mostly just the comic relief character, and I think the way it all concludes with Sokka realizing him and Katara needs to help Aang instead of reuniting with their father is as compelling as it is cathartic, linking nicely into Hakoda's quote about how being a man is knowing where you're needed the most. It's that classic positive masculinity which Avatar does so well. It is also in Bato of the Water Tribe where we are introduced to June, who is yet again another solid side character in this show, and very memorable considering she only appears in 2 episodes, being Sozin's Comet and of course this one. And similar to the Blue Spirit, we get some excellent action and choreography here, especially when it comes to the fight between Aang and Zuko. However, we do have to address some of the decisions made by certain characters in this episode, because as much as I will defend the writing of Avatar The Last Airbender to my death, I will admit that some things do just feel off here. The most obvious example of this being when Aang receives a map detailing the location of the Southern Water Tribe's armies, and choosing not to tell Katara or Sokka or Bato because he was jealous, I guess, and thought that they were going to ditch him. It's just really lazy. Like, the only reason Aang did this was because the plot needed it to happen, and I guess the reason it stands out so much is that, at least in my opinion, Avatar's single greatest strength lies in its characters, specifically how they grow and drive the story forward in a way which feels organic and true to their personalities and arcs. Unfortunately, Bato of the Water Tribe does not follow this formula. It feels more like your standard cartoon, where all character development is reset at the start of each episode, like The Simpsons or something. This extends to Katara and Sokka, who also act pretty out of character. I just don't believe that they would abandon the Messiah's mission to save the world because said Messiah, and best friend mind you, hid a map from them. Although, to be fair, this does set up Sokka's arc about knowing where he's needed most, so I'm a lot more forgiving towards it. And then we have the final character, who people claim to act completely unlike themselves in Bato of the Water Tribe, and that is General Iroh, the Dragon of the West, and his, let's call it, attraction towards June. I almost didn't talk about this at all because I'm aware it's a slightly touchy subject, and if we're being completely honest here, I'm kind of torn on it. Part of me finds it a bit creepy, specifically the moment he pretends to be paralyzed after saving June so that they can lay together for a bit. And I will admit that I can't really see the far more developed and fully realized Iroh of seasons 2 and 3 behaving like this. Yet, on the other hand, part of me does find it pretty harmless and kind of funny, especially Mako's line delivery when Iroh actually saves June. And I think people saying that this is completely out of character for Iroh are forgetting that the guy, while certainly being wise and respectful, is far from perfect. I guess my conclusion on all of this is that the whole pretending to be paralyzed thing is a bit weird, and I'm very glad that the writers didn't turn Iroh into a Master Roshi type character, which they could have very easily done, but I don't know, it doesn't bother me too much. If it does to other people, however, that's completely fair enough. And that's basically it for Bato of the Water Tribe. Definitely one of this season's weaker episodes, although Aang does get a kiss from Katara finally, let's go Aang, and Sokka gets some great character development. I'll give him the MVP for this episode, and let's move on. Whew. I've been looking forward to this one, guys. For me, personally, The Deserter is one of Avatar The Last Airbender's single most underrated episodes for so many reasons. Zhong Zhong is an incredible character. I think everything the episode does in terms of Aang and his relationship to firebending is brilliant. However, what I first have to discuss is how the entire thing is clearly a homage to Francis Ford Coppola's 1979 Palme d'Or winning Vietnam War masterpiece, Apocalypse Now, which just so happens to be one of my favourite films of all time. You think I'm joking? Okay, challenge accepted. We have a deserter who lives in a secluded jungle next to a long windy river, who defected from a horrific war, who sits in the dark and speaks in cryptic philosophical monologues, who resembles the broken spirit of their nation. We have tribal natives loyal to the deserter. We have a talkative, fidgety accomplice who essentially believes the deserter to be a godlike figure. I mean, compare these two clips.
Everything will be fine. He's a great man. Great man.
I'm a little man. He's a great man.
We have a colour palette of murky greens and bold oranges. We have the imagery of fire used to delve into themes of self-destruction and the carnage caused by man. And we have a less experienced soldier on the side which the deserter deserted from, leading an expedition down the river towards the deserter's isolated retreat. His crew is attacked by the natives with spears who attempt to scare them off. Yet the ignorant crew opens fire on the natives, driving them away and showing the supposed superiority of their civilization, but in turn displaying where the true savagery and evil lies. The comparisons are just too blatant to ignore. Like, this was clearly an intentional decision by the writers, and honestly, I just feel so lucky and privileged to have an episode of my favorite television show of all time be such a brilliant homage to perhaps my favorite film of all time. Like, how many people can say that? Anyway, the actual episode itself opens with Team Avatar approaching a Fire Nation colonial village in the northwestern Earth Kingdom, where they find a few wanted posters. One for Aang, one for the Blue Spirit, nice touch, and a couple other guys who I'm sure will have no relevance. There are a few great jokes involving disguises here, the first being Appa hiding behind this tiny bush, the second being this attempt from Aang to hide his identity. That always makes me laugh. And the third being Katara swapping Sokka and Aang's masks to better suit their respective personalities. It's pretty funny. What doesn't make me laugh, however, is first of all, Sokka just blatantly not paying for these fire flakes, but more importantly, the puppet show Team Avatar watch, where we get our first ever glimpse of Fire Lord Ozai. This is such brilliant and subtle world building, especially for a kids show, conveying what I kind of want to call the innocence of propaganda. Like, this is pretty dark stuff, man. They then go watch this performance where this guy is very clearly only pretending to lose control of his firebending, but Aang, being the whipped 12-year-old that he is, goes on to center stage to try and quote-unquote save Katara, doing the same airbending move from the show's intro before escaping with the help of Che, the Dennis Hopper substitute, who we see a few times earlier on in the episode, including on one of the wanted posters, which apparently when translated claims he is mentally unstable, which is pretty funny. Once Team Avatar has escaped, he explains that he serves a living legend named Zhong, the Deserter, who defected from the Fire Nation army and who is the perfect guy for Aang to learn firebending from. And honestly, this scene does such a good job at building up our anticipation for the character of Zhong. You can't deny that Che, despite perhaps being mentally unstable, is a pretty great hype man. Anyway, they are soon captured by Zhong's followers before Che is forced to speak to the mysterious Firebending Master. A lesser TV show would have actually shown this conversation, but I love that the perspective stays with Aang here, with Che eventually emerging from the hut and telling Aang that Zhong doesn't want to see him, that he could tell that just from the way he walked into camp that he's not ready to learn firebending, that he hasn't mastered waterbending and earthbending yet. Again, it's adding to the mystery and wisdom of this guy before we ever even see his face. And when we do meet him, once Aang enters his hut, the guy just completely lives up to all we've heard about him, meditating in the soft candlelight and just dropping all these banging philosophical quotes in this angry, tortured tone. My favorite of which is probably,
"To master the bending disciplines, you must first master discipline itself."
Absolute facts, man. Avatar The Last Airbender once again teaching actual good, legitimate spiritual lessons to kids. Zhong's character design is also great, especially the scars on his right eye which allude to his trauma and the fiery brutality of his past. Anyway, he eventually agrees to teach Aang firebending after he either hallucinates seeing Roku or after Aang just unknowingly turns into him for a bit. Not exactly sure what happens here, but I kind of like how unclear it is. And the ensuing lessons between Zhong and Aang are excellent. They're kind of like this reverse training montage where all Aang is seemingly told to do is stand and breathe and feel the sun, and I think this is all supposed to play on the audience's expectations and desires, because let's be real, we want to see Aang shoot fire out of his fingertips just as much as he does. We're supposed to find all the philosophical, meditative stuff kind of boring. And we, just like Aang, are punished for this in the end when Katara ends up getting burnt due to Aang's hastiness and lack of respect for Zhong's teachings. This is such clever writing, and while I don't think the show 100% agrees with Zhong's philosophy on firebending, as we go on to learn more about the martial art in later seasons, the Deserter does fundamentally change and deepen the way we look at both firebending and the ongoing war central to the show, which has, just like fire, spread and destroyed everything in its path. And this is brilliantly conveyed through the character of Zhao, an old student of Zhong's who represents how the tradition of firebending has become twisted and misunderstood over the past 100 years of bloodshed and violence. He is clearly someone who sees firebending as a martial art of anger and rage, compared to ex-Fire Nation soldiers Zhong and Iroh, who understand it much better.
Power in firebending comes from the breath. That is why you must master proper breath control.
No, power in firebending comes from the breath, not the muscles.
I mean, just think about Zhong's conversation with Katara, about how he's envious of her waterbending and healing abilities.
Water brings healing and life, but fire brings only destruction and pain.
Or how Iroh learnt to redirect lightning by studying waterbenders, and then watch how Zhong firebends. He never actually shoots fire blasts like basically everyone else in the show. No, it's more like waves. It's like waterbending. He's just such a well-written character, man. There's so much depth to him, and honestly, I think he should have been in the show a bit more. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm glad he does come back for an incredibly badass cameo in Sozin's Comet as a member of the White Lotus, but I wish they had resolved his inner turmoil when it comes to firebending like they did with Aang in the Waterbending Masters. Again, it's not a huge deal, just a slight missed opportunity in my opinion, although perhaps in the future they'll write a comic or miniseries where Zhong becomes a sun warrior, or something. I feel like that would be a fitting conclusion to his character. Anyway, Sokka gets understandably angry at Aang for burning his sister, and honestly, it's a pretty uncomfortable moment for obvious reasons. I mean, Sokka and Aang are two of the most likable characters in the show, as well as having such a great friendship, so it is sad to see, but once again, it's kind of justified. Katara learns that she has healing abilities, Zhong tells her to escape while revealing himself to be one of the most powerful benders in the whole show, while Aang in all his guilt vows to never firebend again. More on that later. Eventually this all culminates with Aang rushing to save his teacher, Zhong giving him this badass smirk before disappearing into the woods, and finally the climactic duel between Aang and Zhao, which once again very nicely wraps up all the themes from this episode, with Aang using Zhao's own anger and misunderstanding of firebending against him. Overall, The Deserter is basically a perfect episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and definitely one of my personal favourites of the whole season. Yes, due to all the Apocalypse Now stuff, but also just due to how nuanced and thought-provoking it is. And when it comes to the MVP, it's gonna have to be shared between Aang and Zhong for this one. I'll be honest, the Northern Air Temple feels a little out of place when compared to the rest of the episodes in Book 1 Water's final stretch, especially when it comes to the first two acts, which don't really achieve much other than beginning Sokka's arc of basically becoming the Nikola Tesla of the Avatar world, and Aang's reaction to seeing the mechanization of the temple which he used to visit, which, as a fellow environmentalist and air nomad culture appreciator, I find rather moving, although if he disapproves of this, I can't imagine what he felt when he watched The Legend of Korra.
Yeah, I've been waiting to use that one.
Almost went the whole video without mentioning it. Anyway, what saves the Northern Air Temple, luckily for us, is its final act, which basically turns into some Bloons tower defense Home Alone battle sequence. And it's pretty fun, especially the design of those spinning metal vehicles, and Sokka coming in clutch with the war balloon, although... he just killed all those people, right? It's an okay episode altogether. I'll give the MVP to Sokka. And finally, my friends, we have reached the Northern Water Tribe, where we get a nice little 3-episode story to round off the first season. And overall, I think it's excellent. The Waterbending Master, along with the Siege of the North Parts 1 and 2, are 3 of the best episodes of Book 1 Water. However, they are not quite perfect, so before I go on to praise all the incredible aspects of these episodes, I'd like to quickly address my only 2 real flaws. First of all, I'm not really a fan of the whole Princess Yue-Sokka relationship. It's probably the weakest multi-episode storyline of the entire show for me, for a few reasons. I think in general, Princess Yue is not that well-defined of a character. She kind of feels like the Ember Island player's version of Katara, being someone who is very melodramatic and kind of just cries about everything. I don't really believe her romance with Sokka either. Again, it feels young adulty and kind of plain, like the two don't really have any chemistry at all. And while Princess Yue's eventual fate in the Siege of the North Part 2 is actually pretty powerful, like basically every moment in that episode, the event doesn't really end up having any lasting impact on the overarching plot, or more importantly, on Sokka. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Yue only comes up 4 times again throughout the entirety of Avatar: The Last Airbender, them being the swamp, where Sokka very briefly sees her spirit, the Serpent's Pass, where he talks to Suki about her for like 30 seconds, the Awakening, where she appears to Aang for about 10 seconds, and of course the Boiling Rock, which results in one of the most iconic jokes of the whole show.
My first girlfriend turned into the moon. That's rough, buddy.
So look, I'm not claiming to hate Princess Yue. All I'm saying is that I wish they had given her character a bit more personality and agency and made her relationship with Sokka a little more compelling. And this leads perfectly into my other flaw with the whole Northern Water Tribe arc. It's something I mentioned right at the start of this video, but I'll say it again here. I think the writers shot themselves in the foot by dedicating only 3 episodes to this setting and storyline. Here's the thing. I want to say that these episodes feel rushed, but you know what? I don't even think that's the case. The writers and editors of this show, in my opinion, actually do a pretty remarkable job at fitting so much plot into just over 60 minutes of television. However, These episodes are so crowded with all these different storylines that they can at times feel like they're about to burst at the seams. Because really think for a second about all the different things the Waterbending Master and the Siege of the North two-parter has to achieve. Let me just read out all the individual plot points. Team Avatar arriving at the Northern Water Tribe, Katara having to deal with the sexist culture of the Northern Water Tribe, Sokka's relationship with Yue, Aang and Katara learning waterbending, Zhao attempting to assassinate Zuko, Zhao leading an assault on the Northern Water Tribe, the Northern Water Tribe and Team Avatar fighting back, Aang venturing into the spirit world for advice on how to defeat the Fire Nation, Zuko sneaking into the Northern Water Tribe, Zuko fighting Katara, Zuko taking Aang, nice one Zuko, Zuko giving a monologue to Aang while he talks to various spirits in the spirit world, Zhao revealing that he is going to destroy the moon spirit, Aang talking to Ko the Face Stealer, great scene, Master Pakku cleaning up house, Katara defeating Zuko and getting Aang back, Yue explaining her backstory, Zhao killing the moon spirit, Iroh being a badass, Zuko and Zhao having their climactic duel, Aang becoming... what do people call it? Koizilla? Yue sacrificing herself, Koizilla cleaning up house, Zhao dying and never being seen again, Team Avatar and Team Zuko taking a breather after the battle, and last but not least, the introduction to Azula. There is so much stuff in these 3 episodes, and again, they just about managed to get away with it, fair enough, but would it not have been better if they dedicated a couple more episodes to really let these storylines breathe a bit more? Because at the end of the day, this is Book 1, Water, yet most of it takes place in the Earth Kingdom. Why not cut out a few of the more fillery episodes of the first season, cough Great Divide cough, and dedicate a little more time to all these plot points, to Aang and Katara actually learning waterbending, to this incredible setting which we've heard so much about. Even... I'm about to get cancelled for this, but even the live-action M. Night Shyamalan movie knew that a high percentage of the overall runtime needed to be set in the Northern Water Tribe, and yeah, I just think it's a bit of a missed opportunity, to be honest. But with that all being said, these 3 episodes, while probably not hitting the heights of the latter 2 seasons' conclusions, are still great in their own right. We begin with Team Avatar finally arriving at the Northern Water Tribe, and as I've already touched upon, it's another brilliant and memorable setting. I love the architecture of this place, the way the environment interacts with waterbending, and the overall culture, while of course revealed to be problematic throughout this episode, feels very believable and lived in. It's so exciting actually witnessing all these master waterbenders finally. I mean, I don't really know why none of them are fighting in the war, but I imagine it has something to do with their isolationist policy, so fair enough. As I've already said, I'm not a huge fan of the Sokka Yue stuff, although the whole do an activity together thing is hilarious and something I often quote, but what I am a huge fan of is the A-plot involving Aang, Katara, and Master Pakku, who won't teach Katara because the Northern Water Tribe is a pretty conservative place and believes men should be fighters and women should be healers. I think this whole storyline is executed very well. It's far more nuanced than the Sokka-Suki sexism plot from the Warriors of Kyoshi. I guess because I personally find a guy realizing sexism is bad because he meets a competent woman much less compelling than a guy realizing the entire culture he's followed all his life has seriously limited people's connections to each other, and finally deciding that large-scale change is needed, that he needs to #escape the culture. And overall, I think Master Pakku is a solid character. Obviously he's not the most likable, but he does feel like a very tangible human being, you know? There are people exactly like this. And again, it's so cool seeing a master waterbender in action. His fight between Katara is one of the best of this first season. I do just think that waterbending has the most aesthetically pleasing and creative choreography of the 4 elements. And as I've already said, I find the conclusion to the whole plot pretty mature and nuanced. In this episode we also get Zhao, who I guess became the leader of the Fire Nation Navy in the Blue Spirit, planning his invasion of the Northern Water Tribe and attempting to assassinate Zuko. Don't get me wrong, most of this subplot feels like setup for the Siege of the North two-parter, but while it's not on par with the A-plot, there are still some great moments here, like for example Iroh singing Winter, Spring, Summer and Fall with the crew.
Winter, spring, summer and fall.
Mako's voice is very tender. Zuko telling Iroh that for the last time he's not going to play the Sungi horn. connoting that Zuko does in fact know how to play the Sungihorn, and of course Zhao seeing the broadswords hung up on Zuko's ship and realizing that T is the blue spirit. Great moment and a really good episode actually. I enjoyed this more than I remembered, even if the Sokka Yue stuff is kind of forgettable. As for the MVP, it has to go to Katara here. I love her desire to become a waterbending master. I love how she still wants Aang to learn even if she can't. I love this moment when she goes to the healing place and looks at all the kids who don't even realize that the culture is holding them back. #escape the culture. And I love her rage and anger. She's just such a wonderful, flawed, living, breathing, three-dimensional human being, as is, of course, all the other main characters in this show. The Siege of the North Part 1 opens with Katara suddenly being a waterbending master, I guess, and to be honest, I'm sort of torn on how this all plays out. It's not that I have a problem with Katara being a prodigy, she's one of the main characters in a fantasy kids show, I get it. Aang seemingly mastered airbending by the time he was 12, albeit he was trained by masters his whole life and was also the Avatar, and we get other child prodigies throughout the show such as Toph and Azula. Also, clearly some time has passed since the last episode, it's never made clear how much time, but sure. However, the execution of Katara's sudden mastery of waterbending is a little jarring in my opinion, and is once again something I think would have really benefited from the addition of a few extra episodes set in the Northern Water Tribe. Unfortunately, because we have to deal with the titular Siege of the North, all of Katara's training has to happen off-screen, and I think it's a shame. You know, all the stuff about discipline and practice which Avatar deals with so maturely in episodes such as the Waterbending Scroll and the Deserter are kind of just swept under the rug here. It's a slightly disappointing return to the typical fantasy tropes Avatar usually does a great job of avoiding and subverting, but I guess it's not a huge deal. It's not like it takes anything away from Katara's character. I guess I just consider the omission of her training, as well as Aang's training, a missed opportunity. Anyway, we then have more of Sokka and Yue being by far the least interesting thing about this entire storyline, before the Fire Nation finally arrives at the Northern Water Tribe, and I find the imagery of the black soot raining down, along with Jeremy Zuckerman's menacing score, to be pretty chilling, and overall this battle between the Fire Nation and the Northern Water Tribe is exactly what you want from a season finale, with epic large-scale action sequences and a ton of brilliant character moments. However, I do for the final time want to discuss General Iroh, as it is in this two-parter where we get what I believe to be the final example of the writers still not exactly knowing who Iroh is deep down and where his true intentions lie. Now, we do here get the first mentions of Iroh's 600-day siege of Ba Sing Se, the death of his son Lu Ten, and his journeys into the spirit world, but we also have Iroh genuinely trying to help Zhao, trying to help the Fire Nation, and I guess it doesn't exactly match up to what we know about Iroh come the end of the show. Now, as I've already mentioned, it can be argued that he only agreed to join Zhao on this expedition in order to help Zuko, and I reckon that's probably the case. And of course, later on he attacks Zhao when the guy tries to kill the moon spirit. But what was Iroh's plan here, really? If Zhao didn't want to kill the moon, would Iroh have joined him slaying waterbenders? Or would he have turned on his own country? And let's say Zuko captures the Avatar and brings him back to Iroh. What would the wise spiritual mentor have done then? Would Zuko have received the Lake Laogai speech a season earlier? Would Iroh have saved the Avatar from his nephew's clutches? I don't really know, to be honest. It's one of those things which doesn't really make sense if you think about it too deeply, but it's also not such a plot hole that you can't just fill it up with your own personal headcanon before completely forgetting about it. Still, when you've seen the show countless times, it is a bit strange. Obviously, the actual reason behind this inconsistency is due to the fact that the creators of Avatar only fully figured out what they wanted the character of Iroh to be by season 2, where his desire for Zuko to turn good is much more defined. Anyway, we then have this pretty intense scene where Sokka, along with some of the waterbenders, volunteer for a really dangerous mission. It's actually quite powerful when watching it in the moment, and I think it's a shame that this mission is basically just turned into a joke throughout the rest of these episodes, basically only being there for Sokka to meet Han, the brat who Yue is betrothed to, and to do stuff like this.
Admiral Choi! Prepare to meet your fate!
Did Han just die? You know, it was really unclear. It's just a shame because, again, that first scene actually hits kind of hard. Fortunately for us though, the rest of the episode is pretty strong. I love the stillness before the battle where Aang speaks about how he wasn't there when the Fire Nation attacked the air temples, and that he's going to make a difference this time. I love Aang taking down a whole boat by himself, much like Legolas in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, before looking up and seeing hundreds more boats. Also, all the waterbenders trapping that boat in ice in similar fashion to the boat we see in The Boy in the Iceberg. I love Aang flying back, exhausted and uncertain about whether they can win. Yue saying, "But you have to win, you're the Avatar." And Aang being like, "I'm just one kid," because he is just one kid. It's a great line which really brings you back to reality. And something else I've never even thought about before, and this links to the whole power balance thing I was talking about in the Waterbending Scroll, is how the elements interact with each other when benders fight. I feel like it would have been really easy and obvious for the creators of Avatar to just have waterbending beat firebending. I mean, it obviously would have made sense from a physics point of view, but I'm actually really glad they don't go down the Pokemon route, if you will. The most important thing in any given fight being not the element matchup, but the power, skills, and creativity of the individual bender. And the way the animators beautifully draw the elements interacting with each other just makes it even more believable, which links perfectly into the final scene of this episode where Katara and Zuko duel. And whatever my problems may be with the execution of Katara's off-screen waterbending buff, I will admit that it's so great for the story and her character that she is now able to hold her own against other benders. Something else I love about this fight is how passionate they both are about either protecting or capturing Aang. We see this through the pure aggression of both Katara and Zuko's bending, the latter of whom we see throughout this episode go on an incredibly arduous side quest, just to break into the Northern Water Tribe in the first place. A side quest involving Zuko nearly drowning, and Zuko taking Aang while he's tripping in the spirit world is a great cliffhanger to leave us on. As for the MVP for this episode, I thought about Zuko, but nah, we'll give it to Aang for this one. Don't worry, Zuko's gonna get a lot in the next 2 seasons, so it's fine. So while The Siege of the North Part 1 is good, it's this final episode which really makes this 2-parter the epic, fitting conclusion to Book 1 Water which it ends up being. This really is Avatar The Last Airbender firing on all cylinders, as here we have the great character work, the amazing action, the weird, psychedelic, spiritual stuff, and of course, some top-tier comedy.
Zhao! The Invincible! Get it off! Get it off!
The episode begins with some great leadership and stoicism from Sokka, talking about how they'll find Aang and how it's all going to be alright. Nice one, Sokka. And then we actually get to witness Aang in the spirit world, and let's just say it looks different from last time. In the Winter Solstice 2-parter, the spirit world was portrayed as basically just another more trippy layer of the physical world which was invisible to the unenlightened eye. However, moving forward, it will be depicted as a completely different dimension. And yes, while this slight lore change is another example of Avatar's first season still not exactly knowing the rules of its own world, I don't even care, because this new and improved spirit world is just so cool and weird. Its dreamy, foggy surroundings, combined with Jeremy Zuckerman's mystical score, and of course all the weird spirits who inhabit it, create this otherworldly atmosphere which quite rightly sets it apart from all the other locations in the Avatar universe. Although, I don't know, the swamp comes pretty close to this, but more on that later. And of course, while Aang is gallivanting in the spirit world, we get this brilliant monologue from Zuko where he talks about the differences between them, comparing his struggles to Aang's apparent sense of luck. Both of which, to be fair to Zuko, we have witnessed time and time again throughout this first season. But he also here brings up his sister's natural talent.
My father says she was born lucky. He says I was lucky to be born.
Ozai, Father of the Year, folks. Seriously though, great line, great scene, and excellent foreshadowing for Azula. I believe this is the first reference to her outside of the brief cameo we get in The Storm, and man, I can't wait to discuss Season 2 because she is such an incredible character. Anyway, eventually the Fire Nation armies break through the Northern Water Tribe's outer defenses, and the action is pretty epic. Like, sure, the show has given us lots of exciting fight scenes up until this point, but this is the first battle. we've seen, you know? This is our first glimpse of actual warfare, and Zhao's story about how he discovered the identity of the moon spirit's physical form in some random Earth Kingdom library, which I'm sure will never come up again, as well as Iroh's warnings about messing with the spirits, well, it really builds up the tension for what is about to happen, especially later when Zhao delivers this amazing line.
We're going fishing.
Oh man. What a nefarious guy. Running parallel with all of this is Aang's conversation with Ko the Face Stealer, where he tries to learn more about the ocean and moon spirits, and honestly, I think it's one of the single best scenes in the entirety of Avatar's first season. Everything from the build-up to the conversation where we see this terrifying faceless monkey, to the dim, creepy lighting of the cave, to Ko's incredible design and voice, to the genius added element of Aang having to show no emotion. It's pretty chilling. Avatar rarely dips its toes into the horror genre, what with it technically being a kids show after all, but every time it does, it just absolutely nails it. Ko talks with Aang about how a previous incarnation of the Avatar had attempted to slay him after he stole his lover's face, of course referring to Avatar Kuruk, who, you'll know if you've read the Kyoshi books, is not only one of the most interesting and complex characters in the entire canon, but also the greatest Paisho player of all time, which is pretty cool. They then discuss the ocean and moon spirits, Tui and La, with Aang eventually realizing that they are the little yin-yang fishes from earlier.
The koi fish! I must be going now.
Whew, such a cool scene, man. I also really like Aang hitching a ride off of Heibai afterwards. It's a nice touch. Back to the Northern Water Tribe, and it's now nighttime. We get this beautiful shot of the Fire Nation Navy before witnessing some incredible feats of waterbending, most notably from Master Pakku. I mean, look at this. That's a member of the White Lotus right there. Eventually the rest of Team Avatar find Aang, with Katara very quickly demolishing an overly confident Zuko in what is a pretty unfair fight considering the conditions, before getting what is one of my favourite jokes of the whole season.
Hey, this is some quality rope.
Oh, Sokka, never change. I also really like Aang saving Zuko here. It's what we've come to expect from him by now, but it's still a nice moment. Eventually, Zhao captures the moon spirit, and the entire world goes red. All the waterbenders completely lose their power, and it's a really intense moment. Only slightly undermined by the obvious dip in quality which occurs. It's the only time throughout the entire show that I can think of where the resolution drops, and it's a tiny bit jarring, although you need to remember that this was made in 2005, maybe they just didn't have very good technology yet, so fine. What is not jarring at all, however, is the moment both Team Avatar and General Iroh square up to Zhao, who at this point is clearly losing his mind a bit, having become obsessed with his so-called destiny of slaying the moon, and just listen to Mako's voice acting here.
Whatever you do to that spirit, I'll unleash on you tenfold! Let it go now!
Oh man, chills. Zhao releases the moon spirit back into the water, before unleashing a firebending slice. And oh my god, things just got even more intense. The moon disappears completely, everything goes black and white, Iroh starts firebending like a madman, and we see this look on Zhao's face for a split second, which is just like, oh man, what have I done? Oh well, it's too late to go back on this now, I'm the Moonslayer. Aang inadvertently goes into the Avatar state and delivers what is, in my opinion, maybe the most memorable and stunning visual from the entirety of Book 1 Water, dropping into the pond in this really strange, trippy fashion, before of course becoming Koizilla, causing the waterbenders to bow down, nice touch, and causing the firebenders to absolutely wet their fascist pants. Yue sacrifices herself to the moon spirit, which I'll admit is still a rather touching moment, despite everything I've said about her and Sokka's storyline, while Zhao and Zuko have their final showdown. And I have to say, the use of colour throughout all of these scenes is stunning, with both the orange of Zhao and Zuko's firebending and the blue of Koizilla as well as Yue's eyes, contrasting beautifully with the dullness of the monochrome backdrop. It seems to suggest a new hope, if you will, that has been injected into this bleak and war-torn world. Eventually, the moon returns, much to Zhao's dismay, as the weird spiritual leftover fluid of Koizilla, never thought I'd be saying those words on the internet, capture Zhao the Moonslayer, and the writers didn't even need to do this. but I love the fact that despite their rivalry, despite Zhao literally attempting to assassinate him in the previous episode, Zuko still tries to save Zhao, similar to how he showed him mercy in their Agni Kai back in episode 3. And of course, Zhao, being the stubborn guy he is, refuses Zuko's hand, before disappearing into the water to definitely never be seen again in anything ever. Seriously though, incredible moment, which then rather abruptly fades into the episode's epilogue, if you will, with Paku telling Katara that he'll be travelling to the southern water tribe with some other waterbenders and healers, and that she'll need to be Aang's teacher, Sokka and Yue's dad mourning the princess, Zuko finally simmering down for the first time in like 3 years, and last but certainly not least, Ozai revealing to Azula that he has a task for her. Ooh. Overall, The Siege of the North Part 2 is one of the best episodes of Book 1 Water. It's exactly what you want from a season finale. Basically every single plot point is resolved in a hard-hitting and thematically resonant way, and this might surprise some people, but I'm actually going to give the MVP to Admiral Zhao for this one. The guy is the driving force behind the whole episode, he gets some great character moments as well, and that, my friends, is going to wrap up Book 1 Water. Like I said right at the start of this video, it does not hit the consistent peaks of Book 2 Earth and Book 3 Fire. It is clearly the weakest of Avatar's 3 seasons. And when I do my eventual ranking of all 61 episodes of the show, I can imagine that most of the bottom spots are going to be from this first season. However, let's be real, it's still an amazing feat of animated storytelling, and we only get the perfection of the next 2 seasons because of the incredible characters and world and lore which are introduced right here. But now let's get into what we've all been waiting for, my ranking of these episodes. From worst to best. Number 20, The Great Divide. Number 19, Jet. Number 18, The King of Omashu. Number 17, Bato of the Water Tribe. Number 16, Imprisoned. Number 15, The Boy in the Iceberg. Number 14, The Avatar Returns. Number 13, The Northern Air Temple. Number 12, The Warriors of Kyoshi. Number 11, The Southern Air Temple. Number 10, Winter Solstice, The Spirit World. Number 9, The Fortuneteller. Number 8, The Waterbending Scroll. Number 7, Winter Solstice Avatar Roku. Number 6, The Siege of the North Part 1. Number 5, The Blue Spirit. Number 4, The Waterbending Master. Number 3, The Siege of the North Part 2. Number 2, The Deserter. And number 1, The Storm. And there it is, my very subjective, prone to change in the future, ranking of Avatar The Last Airbender Book 1 Water. Please let me know your own ranking in the comments, I'm very interested in seeing what other people have to say, and yes, I'm sure there will be lots of disagreement, but hey man, that's natural, that's part of life. Hashtag escape the culture. And last but not least, let's have a look at the MVP results so far. In first place, leading the MVP race, we have Aang with 6 points. Right behind him with 5 points, we have Sokka. Coming in hot in third, we have Katara. Joint both with 2 points, we have everyone's favourite uncle and nephew combo, Iroh and Zuko. And each with 1 point, we have Bumi, Roku, Zhongjong, and Zhao. And that, my friends, is going to be it for now. Tune into the next episode where we will of course be discussing and ranking Book 2 Earth, as well as becoming acquainted with a few new faces, such as Blind Girl, Crazy Girl, Bored Girl, Flexible Girl, and everyone's favourite group of nomad hippies. But until then, thanks for watching.